Okay. And can everyone see my screen? All right. Oh, you know what? The date is wrong on there, so just ignore the fact that it says November 17th. It is not that day. Um, or we can go back there. I've not created a time machine just yet. I am working on it. So thank you everybody for joining us for this climate justice working group meeting to discuss the draft disadvantaged communities criteria on today, Thursday, December 2nd, and we'll get started with the meeting. We can change that later. So as usual, the meeting procedures are, if you're not speaking, just try to be on mute so we don't hear a lot of background noise. There is a way to use that on your phone if you're using your phone. If you can be on video, please feel free to be on video. I really can't be on video today. I have one child who has tested positive for COVID, so all the rest are home, and I don't know if you want to see a bunch of children running in and out asking me questions. So, or me pointing them, telling them to get out of the room. So I will be off video. If you also want to be off video, I will not be offended. For purposes of the transcript, if you could just say your name before you start speaking, it just makes it easier for us to make sure that we know who's talking when we go back through the transcript. Okay, and we will start with a bit of a roll call. So let me just make this a little bit bigger so I can see everyone. And I'm just going to go based on what's in front of me now. So I see Eddie is here. He's appeared, but I'm sure he'll be back. We already know he's here. Sonal.
Here.
Abby, hello.
Hello, glad to be here.
Jonathan, good to see you.
Hello, and good morning, everyone.
And, Chris, hello. Nice to see you today.
Hey, good morning.
Joe, good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Mary Beth, hello again. We also have Neil. Hi, Neil.
Hey, good morning.
And Rawa.
Good morning, good to be here.
And we are also joined by Samir Ranade. Hi, Samir.
Hey, good morning.
I said your name right.
Yep, yeah, you got it right. Thank you.
We are also joined by Jared Snyder from DEC. Hi, Jared.
Good morning, everybody.
And our illustrious contractors with the Loom, we have Alex Dunn. Hi, Alex.
Oh, good morning.
And Amanda Dwelly. Good morning, Amanda.
Hi, everyone.
And as always, Sarin Bernard, our admin, is there to help with any glitches or issues. So if you have any questions or if something isn't going right, please feel free to message her and she will take care of it. I don't think she has a speaking function on her computer, so she won't be saying hi, but she might say it in the chat. All right, did I miss anybody? I only have a tiny little sort of screen that shows me everyone, so if I missed you, I apologize. So this is our agenda for today. We will be going over the timeline. We will also be reviewing the critical DAC decisions, potential eligible investments, going through the criteria to review some of the questions. If we have some time, we can do a map review. If not, we can push that to the meeting on December 9th. And discussing, some of the critical areas that we need for voting, breaking it down, the scenarios and what everybody needs to see to get ready for the vote. Does anybody have any questions with regards to the agenda?
Okay. This is Abby. I do have a questions, and I don't want to derail the agenda. So, please tell me like maybe when we can discuss this. But I have some process questions about process. And what I mean by that is, we've talked kind of back, I don't know, months ago now, about what other information we might want to share with the Climate Action Council, specifically around other kinds of recommendations, how to make the rollout of all of this equitable, so kind of beyond the DAC definition. And so I'm wondering when and how we might be able to kind of dig into that and come up with some specific things that we'd like to be talking to them about potentially.
Sure. So as it stands, the goal is for the Climate Justice Working Group to kind of re-engage with the Climate Action Council in January. So we could set up, if we want to, we could set up another meeting to kind of discuss exactly what that looks like and what we want to discuss with them after the vote. We probably would want to do it and exactly when everybody is available. So I'm guessing we'd want to do that after the holidays. So we could, I can send up another doodle poll, and we can discuss when we want to get together to talk about exactly what that re-engagement looks like from our end and what we want to discuss with them. Does that sound good for everyone?
I think that works for me. I don't know how everyone else feels about it.
We could also tack it on the end of the voting meeting, because that meeting is going to be 3 hours. I don't know if we're going to need the full 3 hours to vote, so we could actually even potentially tack it on to that, since I'm sure we'll have some time to discuss what the rest of, for example, what 2022 will look like, what things look like following the vote, if we want to do it then.
Personally, that sounds even better to me. Fewer
Is
meetings.
even better?
Fewer meetings is good, but again, I defer to everyone else.
Does anybody have a preference? Like I said, if not, we can always, like I said, we can tack it onto that voting meeting. I don't think we're going to need the full 3 hours for that. So we can always add that to that agenda and put it there that we then look forward, and we can call that next steps or looking forward, if that's good with everyone. Okay. So this is our draft timeline of the work that needs to be done. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. As we saw, we're going to be going through some of the critical questions and the individual criteria, just discussing, the designation threshold, reviewing the map, and folks can ask any questions that they need to ask before we get ready for the vote, which is going to be on the 13th. There will be, again, another meeting on December 9th to review the maps and do additional Q&A. And of course, you can email myself, you can email Chris, you can email Loom with any questions that you have, and, or even give us a call if you have some concerns that pop up in between now and the 9th. And the goal is to vote on the scoring approach and the scenarios on the 13th. And like I said, there were some additional days proposed right before the holidays if anybody needs to, if we do potentially need to push this out a little bit further, if there is definite, clear discomfort with moving forward with the vote, we can push it out another week if it's necessary. Okay, does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns? All right, I will move forward. So I didn't know if, Amanda, did you want to take this slide or did you want me to do it?
Either you or Alex can take this.
I'm happy to do it, Alana.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Okay.
So I do believe last meeting we made some more progress. We are basically at the point where we're making some critical decisions. We have discussed, reviewed, and approved, not officially voted, but approved on the indicators. We've all kind of agreed and discussed the desire to have a smaller list to start with, and then grow it rather than, trying to contract it later. We've discussed the low income households, the individual threshold. We haven't really decided what to do or how to do with that, but that is kind of what a lot of today will be talking about. We also discussed the need for an iterative approach, with evaluation every year, looking at it and assessing to see how it's working. So there's still some pretty critical decisions that we need to make, and ideally we can make them today. So the idea here is are we going to add some kind of individual criteria, an income-based one? And then how to define that, so we can talk through that. We have some details on that. And then really kind of nail down, are we going to do this, the designation at 35%, as we've discussed before, or shift it? And the last one is just any other additional rules or thoughts that you have that you want to kind of put within the decision. There might not be any, there may be some. It's something we can definitely discuss as we go. So we're going to focus today on really nailing down whether we do the income-based individual criteria, if so, how to define it, and then that designation, because those are the three critical parts that we still haven't officially really pushed forward on.
Alex?
Yep.
I'm so sorry. I don't know if this is later in the agenda or not, but part of what some of us wanted or thought would be really helpful in landing this particular decision was to get a sense. And Chris, brother, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I think that part of what we wanted was a sense of the totality of the climate funding that we're all talking about, this 35-40%, how much of that funding is designed to go to individual households versus the more geographically based definition of disadvantaged communities, which was what which was what triggered that language and that consideration in the law in the first place. So I thought, and maybe I'm mistaken, but I thought that this was the meeting where we were going to drill down a little more deeply on that. Is that right, Alex? And if I'm jumping the agenda, I withdraw.
No, you're good. Those are Chris is going to talk next.
Yeah, so we actually have we have some of that content, Eddie, and we'll get to it once Alex is done here. Yep.
Thanks. Sorry, Alex. Keep going. Sorry.
Definitely teed up to do that. But I'm definitely going to ask that we really push ourselves to get to a decision, or at least close today, because we want to just have one more meeting to vote and then be there. And I think we are actually there. I think we're close. So if with no further ado, I do believe next thing is Chris. Am I right? Am I wrong? Eligible investments.
I think so. Yeah. Let's jump in, and I think we have a couple of slides. So maybe go to the next slide. So Eddie, so one of the things that I wanted to unpack a little bit more today is, kind of there's a lot of nuance into kind of like the question of like what investments go to households versus like, more community-oriented programs. I mean, the reality is like there's the way that the clean energy investments are made, they're kind of economy-wide. So, there's dollars going to households, dollars going to, commercial, industrial projects, transportation, so on and so forth. So it's kind of hard to break out, what would be kind of like community-oriented and, everything else. So one of the first steps, that we wanted to take today is break out all the funding that is going to households based on income, because that is a distinction that we can make easily. And I think that's kind of one of the biggest challenges that we, we've been talking through here the last few weeks is like, how do we handle this, like the potential for like low income households outside of the potential disadvantaged communities. being considered. So we'll talk about that. And then the other thing I'll mention is we're working on getting a full kind of accounting of all of the agency kind of investments, and we're very close to having that complete. So that'll also help kind of with this conversation. And so one of the things that we've been doing kind of in parallel with the criteria focused work is pulling together kind of a framework for kind of how to think about the investments and benefits, and we want to socialize that with the full working group. Well, here we say December, but really before we vote. So, we know time is running short, so we're going to hope to, use some of the time in the next, in the next meeting to kind of walk through the thinking and kind of like lay out kind of, where the inventory kind of lands in terms of investments across the different investment categories that are outlined in the Climate Act, and then talk through how, we could think about, kind of delivering on the benefits and accounting, tracking, and ultimately reporting. So that's something we do want to talk through with the full group pretty soon, but. I will say, where we're kind of leaning in terms of like a proposal is, looking at kind of clean energy spending as the primary metric that we would track towards the 40% goal. And then we would also, make sure that we're measuring and reporting on all of the other co-benefits that are tied to those investments. So, we could talk about that now a bit, but I'll have a lot more to share the next time we meet as a group. So hopefully that's helpful, but maybe we'll get to the investments, the household level investments in a minute, but maybe go to the next slide, please. Is it Saren or Alana who has the controls? So at this point, we have kind of this inventorying of programs and investments that's happening, and we're wrapping up now. And we're also looking at kind of what the capacity is for each of the agencies to be geocoding. Some are doing it now, some are not. And then we need to think about, how can we like take the data that they have available on those investments and start to incorporate it into a reporting framework. So not only kind of, where the dollars are going, but then like what are the other benefit metrics that they track? So, it's a question of, are they tracking things now? If they're not, how do we start to get them to track those things? Or is it a matter of like applying certain factors to data that they are tracking? So, every agency will have a bit of a different, flavor of how we need to kind of think about the geocoding and reporting. And so as part of that inventory, we're also kind of working through kind of like what are the investments look like? Are they place-based? Are they going into communities, or are they like more like statewide investments? And then who is the end user? So are we talking about dollars going to households, dollars going to commercial industrial projects, for instance? And then kind of some thinking on the reporting, is underway now. So we are going to be we're bringing on some additional consulting resources to basically take kind of the initial kind of thinking on the framework and then build it out so it's operational, to put us in a position to be reporting on progress sometime second half of next year. So after we have the final disadvantaged communities criteria, we want to be in a position to start reporting, because I think as we've been talking about, there's there's a lot of work that we're doing now to build the infrastructure to actually to ensure that the state's delivering on the Climate Act requirements, but there's still a lot of hypotheticals. Like we don't know until we know where the disadvantaged communities are, what the the distribution of funding looks like, and so we need to start to be able to track that, and then to the point, I think, I don't know if Alex covered it earlier, be able to review and calibrate annually. So anyway, so that's kind of a quick kind of snapshot on kind of the work that's been kind of going on behind the scenes over the last couple of months, in parallel to the work that we're doing as a working group to get us ready for that conversation. Can we go to the next slide, please? And if folks want to jump in with any questions, please go ahead and do that.
Hey, Chris.
But we'll get to the investments in a minute.
Hey,
Eddie,
Chris.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I dropped it in the chat, but I know it's hard to read that while you're presenting. Just out of curiosity, agents. Look, I get the complications of trying to figure out how to geocode, especially with the disadvantaged community definition not being ready. But there are the potential EJ areas of concern that I thought we all, like the state, agreed would use until we have the DAX definition ironed out. So there is, DEC has a list, at least right now, of what's considered potential EJ communities. I guess my question is, do the agencies that have climate funding understand that they have a legal obligation to geocode this? Like, it's not, they're not doing, do they understand that this isn't a voluntary feel-good exercise, but that they actually have a legal obligation to do that kind of geocoding? Or do you think that there may, and by the way, like it's been 2 years since the law passed with a pandemic in the middle, so I get that, but I wonder sometimes whether all the agencies understand that this is now a legal compliance thing that they need to be taking seriously, or that they need to make it a priority as opposed to something that they may have more autonomy or at least some discretion. Do you have a sense? I'm not asking to name agencies, but I'm just curious if your sense is, are the agencies now fully understanding that this is a law, this is not a discretionary thing on their to exercise at their discretion?
Yeah, so I think at this point the agencies know that they have to do this. I think for some of the agencies, and I can't speak for anyone individually, but what we've seen in what we've experienced just working with staff is they may have started geocoding, or they're not sure like what counts. I mean, because like we're talking about in some cases pretty clear cut investments that count as clean energy. And in other cases, if we go to the housing portfolio of the state, like, there are elements of that work that you could consider to be clean energy or not, and how do you kind of make those determinations and then go forward and geocode. So some of the work that, is to be done and, at NYSERDA and DEC, we are working with the other agencies to just, kind of peel back kind of the programs and the projects and better understand them so we could help, identify like, yes, it is a clean energy investment or not. And so that is all work that, we've had to do to support those agencies. So I don't think it's a matter of them not, understanding. It's, I think, more of a matter of like, just the understanding of, how to, and like what is, an investment that needs to be counted. So, and I think, as we kind of roll out and get alignment on the socialize the benefits kind of framework here, we would expect to have direction kind of provided to all of the agencies. This is how we need to start doing this, and if you haven't done it, we're going to support you to get you there. So that's, that's the work probably that will happen over the next couple of months.
Oh, Chris, thanks so much. And just as a quick direct response, I don't know if you guys have thought about this, but it might be really instructive for all of us, right? To whenever you guys land on that particular definition or distinction, or whatever guidance ultimately gets put together for the agencies to help them assess what is a clean energy program, what is not. The more the the more the Hochul administration, let's put it that way, can make that a transparent, it'd be good for all of us, all New Yorkers, to know what is considered a clean energy fund program or not, right? And I think it's if there's a methodology, if there's something that you guys land on as a guidance for the agencies, I would just urge to make that public so everyone knows, okay, this is what's a clean energy program, this is why, this is what's not, and the rationale for that distinction. But thank you so much. Yeah, I know it's complicated. Thank you.
No, Eddie, yeah, and I'll say there it'll be transparent. So whatever guidance, direction that's provided will be made public. So there won't be any secrets in terms of what counts, what doesn't count, because ultimately we want the reporting. We want the process and the end result to be transparent. So folks should be able to kind of look at what's reported and understand how we got there. So that we do commit to. And so we've been thinking about the conversations that we've had from as a working group over the last 7 to 8 months just on this topic, and have heard from other kind of stakeholders or folks in different venues and are looking at kind of hearing spending as the highest priority because it is a more tangible metric, and we can kind of look at kind of the projects that are being supported directly by tying the benefits metric to spending, and we also kind of heard that a lot of concern about status quo and shifting and adapting programs and approaches to really meet the intent of the Climate Act. So we are taking that. We do kind of agree and understand, like we do need to be able to show progress. So some of the things that have come up that have we've kind of agreed on, and in some cases agencies have started to internalize, looking at kind of requiring certain equity or kind of diversity considerations or requirements in like procurements or contracts. There's obviously the need for more community focused programs. So there's a few examples of those starting to kind of spring up in the different portfolios now. But clearly as we start to look at the big picture, we'll be able to understand where there's additional need, and so we'll want to make sure that we're able to continue to meet the needs of communities as we're kind of implementing, and then kind of the need to build capacity, and improve engagement at the local levels. So, those are kind of three main areas that, we definitely have kind of, heard alignment on from members of the working group and others. And so want to just kind of flag that as, as we're kind of working through, kind of the investments and benefits framework, we do know that we need to ensure that we aren't kind of essentially leaving kind of the current approach in place, and we know we need to make progress. So that's the current thinking there. And so could we go to the next slide, please? And I think this is where, Eddie, we'll get to some of the points, or the main question you were asking is, targeting programs. And so, there's, if we look at the investments that are happening in the clean energy space, they're economy wide. So, there are investments going to households. There are investments going to other clean energy projects, whether that's, commercial, industrial, institutional, there's transportation, there's, distributed energy resources, whether that's like solar, rooftop, or community solar, and so, we could easily kind of identify like what is the budget for residential energy efficiency, but that wouldn't be kind of like fully reflective of, like the types of, or the investment levels that are going into like projects. So I guess what I'm thinking is, Eddie, your question on like households, like I would think that needs to be expanded to like, what are the investments going to projects versus dollars going to, more community oriented, initiatives maybe. And so I don't have a breakdown on that yet because, we don't have an easy way to characterize, all of those types of investments, but we can pull that and provide a better sense of that the next conversation we have on the topic. But wanted to, break down kind of what we can easily distinguish as an area where we have to kind of give a little more thought, and that is, the funding that's going to income-based programming. So as we're kind of thinking about like what is the criteria for a disadvantaged community, and how do we kind of ensure that there aren't pockets of the population that we're kind of like leaving out from being kind of included in that criteria. The one area where I think most folks have kind of flagged as being kind of an area of concern is, lower income households. And so, if we look at kind of the funding that is made available to those sorts of projects, or supports, we're probably on an annual basis, over, just over $1 billion in terms of the amount of resources that are targeted at those households. And so the bulk of that comes in the form of, energy assistance, bill payment assistance. So, LIHEAP, and utility bill assistance, it comes in around $800 million every year. We also, have, a couple $100 million that is targeted at low-income energy efficiency. So this is like NYSERDA programs like Empower, the Weatherization Assistance Program, and then the utilities have funding as well that is going to low or moderate income energy efficiency. Roughly half of that, a little more than half of that funding is targeted specifically for affordable multifamily buildings. And so, and then we have another $40 million a year that is really kind of focused on access to solar. So, rooftop, community solar. And so this is all kind of like as budgets are allocated today, it's likely that, the low income energy assistance budgets are probably going to remain constant because, a bulk of that is LIHEAP, and LIHEAP is intended to, kind of help people pay for their heating bills. And, on the utility bill assistance side, again, it's, targeted at helping kind of reduce energy burdens for households. So it's likely that those budgets are going to stay the same. As we're thinking about the bigger picture, related to, what's being talked about at the Climate Action Council, decarbonizing the economy and ultimately, like, as part of that, electrifying households and, getting buildings kind of in a position to decarbonize. There's going to be a big need to focus on low and moderate income households. If we're talking about electrifying those, there's so many challenges and barriers that come into play, right? So not only the ability to like pay for the work that's done, but then there's like additional work that's going to be needed to electrify. So whether like that's structural deficiencies or health and safety issues or whatever. So all that to say, like it's likely that the funding that's going to those sorts of initiatives is probably going to increase over time. but there's nothing, there's no certainty what that looks like at this point. There's still some thinking around what's going to happen with like the federal kind of infrastructure funding coming into the state, for instance. So as we sit here today, it's a little over $1 billion that goes into these sorts of programs. And I think the main challenge that we have is like it's going to be it's difficult to target these types of programs to geographic parameters, right? So on one hand, like we're dealing with like an intersection of public policy. So whether that's in the case that we're dealing with, we're trying to advance climate justice and equity, and then on the other hand, these programs are also targeting energy affordability to make sure people aren't left out in the cold when it's freezing out. So I think one of the things we're going to have to kind of grapple with is as we've talked about the last couple of meetings is to what extent are we comfortable kind of incorporating these households into the definition, just to ensure that the funding that is dedicated there like continues to be a priority, and we don't leave any households out. The other thing that I'll say is that this is one part of the clean energy portfolio. There's additional funding probably equal to the level of funding that is going in here, $1 billion that is also going to other types of projects. So part of what the agencies are going to have to do is adapt the funding that's available, and ensure that we're targeting disadvantaged communities above and beyond kind of what's happening for lower income households. So let me pause there and open up for discussion. I hope this is helpful, but we'll be able to provide, like I said, a better kind of picture of the funding by investment category the next time we connect.
Chris, this is Abby. I do have, I guess, two main questions. And kind of first going back to your previous two slides, when you're talking about the reporting plan that the agencies are developing, I heard from you that, the spending is the primary metric, that it will also include co-benefits. Will the reporting include also those process considerations you mentioned and specific metrics to address that status quo and overcoming the status quo? And so I'm thinking about like, are you at this point, kind of where's your thinking about what would the metrics be that address transparency and accessibility, inclusivity, and equity in the process, not just in the, kind of outcome?
Yeah, so I think we'd love input on that for sure. But I'll just speak for NYSERDA. One of the things that we're the things that we're looking at are uptake of programs in communities of color. Looking at kind of our contracting, like, are we supporting, MWBEs? Are we kind of requiring kind of hiring of technicians from, disadvantaged communities? So there are a number of kind of outcomes that, we'd want to be able to track and report on, because I think the main thing that, is lacking, right, across the space here is just a good baseline. Like, where are we today with a lot of those, indicators of kind of an equitable, inclusive, clean energy economy. So I think what we want to do, and the more kind of the more thoughts that you all have on this in terms of like what are those other kind of outcomes or like metrics that we could capture. We want to make sure that we're kind of including those, so that way we can track and calibrate, right? Because ultimately like I think like we said before, like there are a lot of hypotheticals sitting here today. Like once we know what the disadvantaged communities might look like, then we'll have a better sense of like where the funding is kind of going. We'll be able to get better intel on the actual kind of investment types that are that are being made or happening, and then from there we'll be able to kind of figure out where we need to shift and adapt. So it's almost like building the infrastructure, right? Like how do we let's get the infrastructure right so that way we can put the state and agencies on a path to to reach the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, and I want to just recognize that NYSERDA is doing a lot of good work in this regard right now, and so I think from my perspective, obviously NYSERDA is on the right track. I would want to make sure the utilities and the Public Service Commission and the other agencies kind of have that shared understanding of what the process expectations are. And I was recently kind of skimming through the California Public Utilities Commission's Environmental and Social Justice Action Plan and feeling a little envious of that. And I don't know if that's something that you've taken a look at already and are maybe using as a model to think some of these things through. But that would be kind of my one, thing that I just want to point out that I would love to see, I guess, next time when you report on this is making sure those process considerations are included in that framework. And then I guess also related to that, kind of the oversight of it all, I know that I'm not totally clear on, moving forward. And this might, again, this is maybe our conversation for looking forward to 2022, but like, what's the climate justice working group's role? What's, I know NYSERDA has convened this other collaborative, I can't remember what it's called, sorry, group, or is working on building that. So who's in charge of what, and having a little more clarity on, with an ongoing basis, what are the back and forth conversations that make sure this is kind of on track and going well. So put that out there. And then the other quick thing I wanted to note about this slide is just, when I look at this specifically with where money is being spent currently, part of me, to count, obviously HEAP and utility bill assistance is super duper important, but that's not really investment in helping families like make the transition to clean energy. It's helping them kind of weather the current state, but in terms of like getting the work done to not need energy bill assistance over the long term. I just wondering what your thoughts are about, what does that look like in the long term, investment priority wise? Yeah, well, so that's another hour conversation, but I'll give you my elevator pitch on it. So the law requires us to track low-income energy assistance. So that's why it's, on the table here. But, I think, and I think we've all kind of talked about this and, in public settings, I think we want to be in a position where, energy bill assistance is a Band-Aid and not the primary, it is not the primary kind of intervention to get people to a lower energy burden. So it's really a question of like, how do we kind of work with those other, programs and policies to get a more, dynamic kind of way of providing bill payment assistance. There's a lot to it that I'll probably take us way off course, but just thinking about how we could utilize more kind of LIHEAP funding. So OTDA, who aren't on the call, so I don't want to kind of implicate them in anything that they can't respond to, but I will say that they've, over the last few years, they have allocated more HEAP dollars to weatherization activities, with the idea that, if we can reduce consumption of LIHEAP clients, that'll help reduce their reliance on bill assistance, and there's a way to continue to, make that shift. The more we can kind of reduce reliance on bill assistance, like you said, will be for the best, because there'll be more resources that can go into
other things. As long as we're helping the households pay their energy bills, right? If we reduce consumption, get them to an energy burden that is manageable, that's the outcome that we want. So, the colleagues that we have at OTDA, I think are on board with kind of that vision. It's just kind of continuing to get them there, because like they're balancing, 1 million to 2 million people every year that need a cash benefit, and the more that they take out of out of that pot to put into weatherization, it creates kind of other issues for those clients, so that aren't being served. So anyway, so there's a lot to it, but agreed that we want to get to a place where we are looking at prioritizing those sort of interventions that are reducing consumption. The last thing I'll say on this, and we can move on, is the DPS recently created an energy affordability program working group, and as part of that, NYSERDA is required to pull together an energy bill analysis that looks at kind of bills, for low-income households across different strata. So trying to understand like what is the typical energy bill, and then what are the implications of the various clean energy interventions. So looking at like if we are able to say like, if we hit this household with a retrofit, can we like credibly say we're reducing energy burn by so much? What does it mean when we're adding electrification then? Do we see an increase in energy burden or not? So like a lot of that work, unfortunately, is happening like in parallel, and it's going to take a couple of years, I think, to get us where we want to go. But I think the pieces are in place to start making progress there. So hopefully that's helpful, and I didn't derail too much. And then the last thing I'll just mention, Abby, the question on like who's in charge. I will say your point about the NYSERDA collaborative that we just stood up. The intent there is to really kind of first focus on NYSERDA programs and initiatives, with the idea that we have other agencies at the table, so they can hear and coordinate with stakeholders that are participating in the collaborative. But in terms of the climate justice working group, Alana, I'll let you kind of to weigh in on this, but we have talked about the need to have an annual review of the DAC criteria. As part of that, I would imagine we would also want to make sure that we're assessing how it's working in terms of like ensuring that we're getting benefits to communities. So I would suggest that part of that kind of review process, and I don't know if it's like a couple times a year or whatever, but it's kind of leveraging kind of like what's being publicly reported, what we know about what's happening on the ground, and calibrating kind of what's happening. But
yes, I had some ideas about how often we should be meeting a year to make sure that that's working. That's only something I want to have discussed with the group. I don't want to, be so bold as to be insisting that we meet, I don't know, 7-8 times a year, but I would absolutely want to discuss, that in the future, possibly meeting quarterly, if that's something that everybody would be willing to agree to.
so maybe we could table that and come back when we can talk about process a little bit more. But any other kind of thoughts or questions on like investments? I know it's a big consideration for everybody in terms of like getting to a place where you're comfortable with what the criteria are. So Abby, we heard wanting to look at what are the other outcomes that we would want to be reporting on, in addition to the investments as being important. Do other folks have
Hey, Chris, this is Rawa.
initial
Can you
thoughts?
hear me?
Hey, Rawa. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for all of this. This is really, really helpful, although sometimes I find it challenging to wrap my head around all of it. So I'm going to try to take little tiny bite-sized chews. I had a couple of questions. One is, I'm definitely leaning towards inclusion of individuals that is going to be based on income, and happy to have that conversation so we can come up with criteria. Partially because many of us live in changing neighborhoods. And of course, as climate change continues, we're going to see a lot more climate refugees, in particular at the urban core. Investments in making sure that low income people that are living in communities that might be changing or neighborhoods that might be changing could be a really good anti-gentrification strategy to keep them in their homes through investments of, having cleaner, better weatherized, and then maybe producing energy as well. The other question that I had for you was, you brought up a really good point, and I really think of it as a long-term equity strategy, but also wealth building strategy, is making sure that we have a really good, diverse MWBE pool, both along the entire supply chain. And so as you guys are thinking about that, do any of the state agencies provide training to, and recruitment of MWBEs? And I don't know what kind of money is being invested there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't, off the top of my head, I can't say. I know, the state does have a requirement for agencies to meet certain MWBE contracting and procurement thresholds, but it's escaping me what that threshold is right now. But I do think, without kind of going back and looking at the Department of Labor or ESD, I'd say we're probably not doing enough in terms of investing in MWBE kind of like development, business development or support. But we'll have to kind of
appreciate you saying that. So I agree with that assessment. It's not to like be punitive in any way. I think it's just important to have a realistic conversation. I think it's a huge missed opportunity, and maybe some funding needs to be committed or dedicated to that. Like there's a really, Milwaukee does a really good job in particular with its water infrastructure and green infrastructure sort of methods. And then what they've done is really invested a lot of money in training potential MWBE clients, and it's actually successful. So I would just say the way, and I think New York State is doing its level best. I'm not blaming anyone, but there's so many workarounds around meeting a lot of those MWBE requirements, because oftentimes they're difficult to find contractors or folks that can do procurement that are MWBE. So I would just say that needs attention, especially if we if we really want to address equity in New York State. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was, maybe I lost it. Yeah, so this idea of infrastructure, I just really want to applaud NYSERDA for how, I know it's difficult for y'all, but appreciating that you're just doing the hard work around this concept of like co-design with, folks on the ground that have local expertise and knowledge. And I think that really that could be a model that many of the other state agencies put in place. And part of, as we're talking about assessments over a long period of time, those are going to be the kinds of collaborations that are going to give us better evaluations around what is actually happening on the ground. If you guys are being successful, if we need to pivot and so forth. So it might be hard, I think, in the beginning to build that infrastructure out, but I think in the long term, it's going to be beneficial to everyone.
Yeah. Thanks, Rawa. And that's a good point, right? I think, unfortunately, there are a number of like parallel paths that have to be kind of worked, in this space right now. So like, we're primarily focused here on like the criteria, but it's so related to like the process and the other kind of change work that needs to happen. So I certainly appreciate everybody's concern about how do we get how do we take that next step and ensure that we're delivering on the outcomes that we need, and making sure we have the right outcomes identified. So that unfortunately will have to be continue to be a parallel path, but we want to kind of work through that with everyone, right? So we want to hear the input. We want to kind of align on what we need to be tracking and accounting for. And and I think the process questions like, co-designing and, engagement and collaboration. It is a lot of work. I mean, a lot of people do kind of, just think about engagement as like, a one-off, but you have to establish, lines of transparency and accountability and trust, and there's a whole lot of work that has to happen there. And and I'll just speak for NYSERDA. We hadn't done a whole lot of that in the past, and so the last couple of years we've made incremental progress. But what we're hoping to do now is really kind of take that up a level, and so hoping that we could, like you said, we can use that as an example for other agencies as well.
And then I just have one last comment, and I'm gonna stop. I also just wanted to say, I think the Climate Justice Working Group certainly appreciated the work around the modeling and the costs of what we're talking about in order to implement CLCPA successfully. Is we really do need to have, I think, a coordinated strategy between the state agencies, the governor's office, and the legislature, that we're gonna have to figure out generating more revenue, because there just isn't enough money currently to be able to put in the budget to begin to even fund these programs at a very, very small rate. Even if we just say we're just going to start with the floor of 35%, the money's not there. So I don't know how we do that in a coordinated and like collaborative and strategic way, but I think it does need to happen. And then lastly, Alana, I'm more than happy. I'm not going to be happy about it, but I will. I think we should meet 7 times a year and maybe quarterly at the least. But I definitely think that we've done so much work, and there's still so much more that needs
Well,
to
I just threw that 8 number out. That was just that was more of a shock, so that you would be more willing to agree to the other number that I have.
No, I'm 100% with you. I don't want to, but I think we need to. Thank you.
Stonal, I see that you had a comment. Did you want to?
Yeah. Thanks, Alana. I was just about to say maybe I should explain what I wrote in the chat. Abby was talking about outcomes, which I think is the right terminology to use when we're measuring the quote unquote benefits. Workforce outcomes, definitely, and I think folks generally have been thinking about that. That's pretty clear that it's not only about the investments, but who's employed. But I mentioned a step further around ownership and that outcome, because, I put a random example in here based off of nothing specific, but, if we're employing a big company that's not owned by people in disadvantaged communities, they're still making major profit off of being contracted to do that work, even if, even though they're sort of hitting that 40% if the people that they've employed are from the disadvantaged communities. So I think that's just, one step further. And I think a lot of our groups, like Eddie wrote, have done a lot on that ownership piece. The prime example we point to is the worker cooperatives being a great model. But in general, thinking about not only how many people are working in this field from disadvantaged communities, but how many businesses, companies, and nonprofits and groups we're employing that are based and run by and owned by people in disadvantaged communities.
That's a great point, and I think I think some of the work ahead of us over the next few months is to be digging into what are the best ways to measure for those outcomes, so for certain like program areas it might be easy to report on, but in other cases we may need more of like a survey-based kind of approach. I don't know, and I know that's not the topic for the conversation today, but I think that kind of tees up nicely the work that'll come over the next couple of months, and I think I mentioned we do have some additional resources coming on board, which will be dedicated to working through that reporting structure, the benefits, co-benefits, outcomes that we want to make sure we're reporting. So more to come on that when we're able to share in terms of timing. other thoughts or questions on this section? Because I know we have a lot more to cover.
Just a quick question, and along this line, and thanks, Sonal. She acknowledged that I just dropped in the chat the issue of ownership when it comes to clean energy and Black and Brown communities. There's a partnership that we've had for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now with Push Buffalo, Uprose, and The Point, called Revitalize. The idea is to work together to develop replicable models that communities could use in terms of actually owning clean energy infrastructure. And what's ironic about that is NYSERDA actually developed at least it was a one-time only, I think, grant program that you guys named after our partnership. There was a Revitalize NYSERDA grant program, I think, that was intended to help build out some of what we're doing, at least with our initial partners. Do you know, Chris, if this is something that NYSERDA is thinking about revisiting? Because the idea behind that grant program was exactly what we've been doing with Revitalize for the last 4 or 5 years. What Sonal just mentioned, kind of this collective desire to start looking at ownership as opposed to a more client, disempowered perspective for our communities. Do you know if that's something NYSERDA is? Oh, the NYSERDA, if you could speak to whatever NYSERDA's experience was with that particular grant program, and if in fact that's something that's being considered, that'd be great to know.
Yep. Yeah. So we actually, I remember sitting down in like an RMI session with a few.
Yes, it was RMI. That's right.
Yeah.
It was RMI. That's right. Good. I'm sorry.
And there was like a that was like one of the early design things that we did together. But so the experience on the Revitalize grant program was kind of a mixed bag. So there were a couple of organizations you mentioned them that were able to really make some progress, and then there are others who probably weren't ready. And at the time, we didn't resource the grants, I think to the level that we probably should have in order to provide the technical kind of capacity and support to those organizations. So, so we didn't have as much success as we wanted. But that said, one of the things that is going to happen in the beginning of next year, we should be kind of communicating more about this in the next week or two, is like our New York Sun program. We are going to be hosting a co-design kind of effort that will include kind of a focus on ownership models. What do they look like? What's needed? And how do we kind of get to a place like you said, Eddie, like that we're establishing replicable models, and then what are the supports that are needed to actually replicate, in other parts of the state or in other communities. So that's something for sure that we're going to be committing to and funding, with the experience that we had, from Revitalize in mind. Like we know we need to kind of take some different approaches there. And I'll just thank a lot of some of your staff and colleagues at organizations have worked closely with us to kind of get to a point where we're ready to start this co-design next year. So it's been underway. The thing has been underway for a few months now, but more to come on that. And then I think generally though, we do want to explore kind of ownership models, beyond kind of solar. So, we want to think about when we're thinking about resilience, resilience hubs, microgrids, that might kind of take a step beyond solar, what could that look like? So yes, we're interested. Okay, so if no other comments or points just on this section, maybe we'll keep the agenda moving. I don't know who has the floor next, but I'll pass it to Alana, maybe?
I think it's me.
Oh, Alex.
But Alana, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so Chris just gave us a lot of detail and a lot of good
Sorry.
things. I think that the next one is really the question of there are some undecided components here. So really what I want to really ask and get through here is what do you need, and how can I say this? What information do you think would change the way you would vote is, I guess, the way to think about this now, because we can always get more information, but would it really change the way that you would vote or the decisions you would make at this point? And so as we go through and start thinking about individual criteria, whether you'd want it, whether you'd be okay with it, the definition of that, what is it? Is there anything that would change the way you'd vote in addition to what Chris just outlined?
I don't think Alex, and thanks so much for teeing this up. I don't think what I'm about to say is totally responsive to what you're asking, but it gets to what you're trying to I think resolve with this question, which is like make up your minds already. So here's my basic problem. My two basic problems over these long months have been what is fair for New York City downstate versus the rest of the state? Because at bottom, the clustering, the density of low income people in downstate is in the millions. And like I just it's hard. I'm still struggling trying to land in a place where we're in a fair place where and it goes back to the original leave no DAC behind, right? So to me, that's one thing, the geographic fairness, what is fair. And then secondly, it's the household versus community thing. When we first worked on CLCPA, the idea was always about the aggregate, about the communities, the event, because it was, at bottom, a lot of the thinking was about infrastructure, right? And you don't usually talk about that, at a household level. So, what I worry about is the more we lean towards trying to capture households, is that going to have a disparate impact? Is that going to take away from, or in other words, dilute, community aggregate settings? Which is so. Those are my two basic problems with landing, feeling good and landing a decision. So again, it's not exactly what you're asking, but those are the two existential kind of acts of mental juggling I've been doing that's made it difficult for me. And I don't, obviously other folks can speak for themselves. But thank you.
Yeah, no, Eddie, I think that that's totally on point, right? So I guess the part then is like we need to have that conversation and we need to hash it out and kind of work through it, because those are the very big questions. And I think that my sense is no amount of added information is really going to help you make that decision. It's kind of okay, let's look at what we've got and go. And what you've just brought up are the really big questions, and it's hard to make that decision. So I want to like enter in with empathy here. It's not an easy decision. I'm pushing because I think that's where we need to go, is to really head on talk through what you just summarized, Eddie, which is trying to create an equitable system so that New York City and the rest of the state are getting what they need to address this. And in the long term, I think that this is how can I put this? This is something that I think, Rawa, you mentioned working with budget and trying to figure that out. Creating a non-zero sum game here is actually what you need. And so that's not necessarily anything that the DAC definition can do or anything that this working group can do right now, but adding more funding rather than repartitioning where the funding goes is kind of the place there that will allow you to do that. And there's really nothing that the definition can hold on that. And so that's really tough, because most of what I see in this industry, this is just me, so ignore this, like the, the legal disclaimer, my own opinions, not that of anyone else here kind of thing, is that we enter into these zero-sum game kind of discussions without thinking about, well, let's break that mold and start anew. And so that's a budget discussion. So I wanna really push on that one, Eddie. I think that you can push on that. The second one is more of a, what you can put guide rails on things. You can we're not saying, and nor do I think it's, because this is a system where we are creating this together, and it's really here, us, especially Amanda and I are trying to be the sponges of what you say and then come back and give you some ideas here, is that in no way do you have to just say, okay, it's individual criteria and that could maybe subsume everything accidentally. So in this case, like, you can put guide rails on things, and we can do that to make it feel like you're not going to disproportionately kind of get one region to have more than their quote unquote fair share. Make sense? Not beautifully articulated, but we'll go there. Let's go to the next couple slides. Okay, so I think this is really where we're at now. We've gotten the indicators, we've got all the things, we've done the best we can using the data we have to create this geographic designation. And so really there's kind of this idea of, do we keep a 35% designation, add some kind of household income individual criteria, and that could be federal poverty line, it could be state median income, it could be area median income, 80%, 60%, 100%, all of those different parts are there. And then we can articulate guardrails as well. So I would like to hear from everyone at this point to think through, what else is there that this group can do for specifically creating the definition? Is there anything else that we're missing here? And if not, then let's hash out that individual criteria part. So Abby's got a question. Oh yeah, you
Go
say
ahead,
it.
Abby.
You say it. Oh,
I can wait. Go ahead.
is that you, Sonal?
Yeah, I was just going to ask quickly, like, why does the second purple bubble not say 35 to 40%? Maybe I missed this.
One thing we somewhat kind of agreed on, that if we add individual criteria, increasing the designation to say 40% plus individual criteria would cover a very large percentage of New York State, and that you didn't want to create something that would be necessarily over the 40% threshold in total. And so if you add a geographic designation of 35%, or some, let me say this differently. If you add a geographic designation that has, say, 40% of the census tracts, plus individual criteria, you're getting somewhere on a 50% of New York State will be covered through this, and that's more than the 40% share of funding. Does that help? Yeah. Cool. Abby's got a question about, for Chris, really, which would be easiest to implement? So that is 60% of state median income or 80% of area median income.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of like what's easiest, I don't know if it's a matter of it being easy, but it's like what everything is structured around right now is 60% of the state median for low income like programs. So like all of those, bill payment assistance programs and like the weatherization assistance program and Empower are all kind of targeted at 60% of the state median income. And then there are, programs like our multifamily, like the multifamily programs and like solar initiatives that are available for families up to 80% of the area median income. So yeah, really, at least in terms of the clean energy portfolio, we aren't and don't have the ability to easily administer to 100% of the federal poverty level. So, you know, if from an administrator's perspective, I think we'd want to stick to the 60 and 80% state and area.
Alana, can you move to the next slide? I think that kind of outlines some of this.
I think it's slide 17. Two more slides. This one.
Amanda, you want to talk through?
Sure. This just recaps what Chris said, that a lot of the energy bill assistance and energy efficiency programs are using that 60% of state median income, whereas some of the affordable housing and rent relief programs and some energy programs are using the 80%. Few programs are really using the 100% of federal poverty line. It is pretty low. We do have more info on exactly what these are in dollars and number of people it would add on other slides.
Quick question along these lines. We probably don't, but I'm just curious. Do we have? Is there any? Does a demographic breakdown of these numbers exist anywhere? Specifically, racial breakdown for the say like that second bullet of low income, you know, HEAP, Empower, et cetera. Does that exist anywhere? Again, a racial demographic breakdown.
It's very hard to do within the census, as insofar as I mean, we can, and I think Amanda's actually looked into some of it. To your point,
Alex, I'm sorry. Oh no, I didn't mean you all. I don't know. I meant whether this is tracked. Yes.
Gotcha.
Whether it's tracked internally by NYSERDA, but most likely not. I just thought I'd ask.
So we for the longest time we didn't ask demographic questions on applications for a lot of reasons. Like we didn't really have a systems built out to track it. There was a concern about like, you know, people not wanting to fill out that information on an application. So anyway, last year we incorporated it again, but we're not able to require that people fill it out. It's just an optional thing. So we are able to start tracking, you know, for people who actually respond, you know, with that data. But the other thing I'll say is I'm trying to look this up while we're talking, so sorry for sounding a little like discombobulated, but we do have we did some initial analysis a few years ago based on just ACS data. I mean, to Alex's point, like it is kind of tricky with census data to get kind of like certain levels of precision on these things, but we did do some kind of like interpolation of data and came up with just some estimates of, you know, households by race and ethnicity that fall into kind of like broad, well, actually, no, the three main income groups. One is like the 60%, one is the 80%, and then we kind of subdivided the 60% to like really low income households. And so that's in a database that's available on our website. So I'm trying to pull it up right now, but I could do that while we're talking about other stuff, and I could share what we have. If people that are listening are interested, it's if you go to NYSERDA, Google NYSERDA LMI tool, and it'll bring you to a web page, and you can, you know, select the criteria you want to look at and pull up the data.
Eddie, one thing that differentiates the geographic DAC definition from others in many ways is that we really do pull out race more than any other one at this point. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, my interpretation is that you're worried about those Black and brown residents of New York that are more middle income that still have the barriers and have less access to things because of the structural racism involved. And if that's the case, one of the things I think that our definition that we've created together has done is really try to encompass those groups as well. It doesn't do it perfectly, but at least it does that, which I think helps toward that. With an individual definition, or at least this income specific one, I think that is not, like, I don't know whether we can do any more as far as adding kind of an additional element, mostly because for implementation of programs, I think it will be tough to get the information, the demographic information.
I hear that, and I appreciate, obviously, like, we can only do however, like, whatever information is available to us is how we implement. But I'm wondering, really to kind of get to what maybe Eddie's alluding to as well, and it's a thought that I had is, even when we're looking at generally from an equity standpoint and structural sort of oppressions and histories, is a person who is not a BIPOC person at the 60%, qualifying at the 60%, but then qualifying maybe BIPOC folks at 80%, because we know how generational wealth is built in this country is through inheritance and other sort of forms of wealth that folks have been able to build that generally BIPOC folks don't have. Even if they are currently moderate income earners, they may be the first generation or may just be for a very short period of years, and they don't have any significant wealth that's built in order to actually transition when we think about transitioning off of fossil fuels. So just something to consider, and maybe not in like the first year or two of implementation of this, but over time, are we building in, how do we build in language around refining equity screening tools moving forward over a long period of time?
Love that, Roa. I think, and this is where some of the recommendation components of, it's not just that you're saying, let's put forth this scenario with these kind of things. It's also that you can put forth within that scenario the requirement to look into that, or to try to gather that information so that in the future we can refine this and really, we need to measure it first to know what's going on and what's missing. And that clearly is not there. So, Sonal, I think you're next.
Yeah, I think what in this chat brings up a good point, at least for me, that makes me grapple with which income we might choose if we go that route, which is that, like Chris and Amanda said, that the AMI number varies by county in New York State, and there's like a huge variation of what that is. Like I pointed out, Nassau County, the AMI is $100,000, somewhere around $100,000. But the SMI, my understanding is, doesn't vary. It's just set for the state. So to me, that factors into which one I pick, because either you're advantaging some places that might have higher median income to qualify, or you're disadvantaging other lower income ones. So yeah, that's just factoring in. So I thought it'd be good to bring that out too.
I think that's actually really huge. Amanda, is it the next slide that has the breakdown? Let's see.
Actually, it's the previous slide. Oh no, you're right. It is the next slide.
And maybe while we're pulling to that slide, I'll just offer. So I think some more context on why the state has kind of landed on like those two thresholds primarily for the energy programs. It's basically to establish categorical eligibility for other types of like assistance programs. So the 60% SMI in New York is the threshold that the LIHEAP program uses, and so the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance and all at the counties, at the Department of Social Service, they're all kind of they're screening eligibility for a couple million people a year based on that criteria, and if they're found to be eligible, we could automatically kind of enroll them in programs. I mean, there are people in households that are still served that aren't categorically eligible, and they just go through a process where we have to like vet, check their income and make sure they're eligible. And the 80% AMI is really kind of tied to affordable housing, right? So affordable housing in the state, in most places, can go up to like 120% of AMI. But a number of many of the affordable housing units in the state are kind of at the 80% threshold. And to the point I think Sonal you were making, or Abby, the reliance on area median income is really to kind of really take into account those economic circumstances in the region. So like a household making $100,000 in New York City is gonna look a lot different in terms of their means, like what's available to them after living expenses are taken into account than somebody making $100,000 in Albany or whatever. So I think that's the other kind of thing to consider here is there are kind of regionality kind of implications.
Yeah, I want to dig into this because I think we have two things that are balancing this out. And one is that we've got how things are implemented and how easy it would be to kind of continue with this. And so using state median would be kind of the thing. Am I right there in interpreting that, Chris? Like that would be the preference of the agencies to be able to keep something like that?
Well, I mean, to be clear, I mean, it's both like 60 and 80% is what programs are designed, on. And I wouldn't say it's a preference. I mean, administratively, we don't have an option. We're unless we're talking about, sinking significant cost into developing ways of screening and determining eligibility for households. I would say that's a non-starter, but folks can weigh in on that.
Staying quiet because I want to hear. So in some ways, part of the reason why I'm really going through this and thinking through this is that total percent of the state and the geographic region, and then also that regional equity component that we're talking about. And this is what makes this tough, and this is what makes adding a household kind of individual criteria tough, and really trying to push for us to where are people in this kind of category. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of things coming through. I just want to make sure.
I'm still for including low-income households.
But I guess I'm wondering, Alex, is it? I guess one of the things that we're not sure about right now, and maybe I'm wrong, so correct me, please. We don't necessarily know how many of these like low-income program participants are located in DACs. So kind of like the number that we're actually adding, may or may not be. I don't know. I guess there's variability here. That's what I'm saying. Until we actually do the accounting, we don't know.
I think that's true. Although we do know based on the census. So and Amanda can walk through this. Like we basically took the DACs and took them out, right, and then looked at the percentage within the area outside of DACs that would meet these different thresholds. And if you had full participation across everyone, this is what it would add, right? Because that's kind of the point. So this would be the top bounds of funding that could go if everyone participated. Amanda, do you have anything to add there?
I do think that adding 60% of state median would be slightly more than this 14% potentially. We don't have that 60% in the census data, so we use this 200% below the federal poverty line, which is a little less. I know the directions are confusing, but I think it would be just a little bit more than 14%. So pushing it a little bit more than 50% on, the total maximum number of people who could be eligible for this funding or accounting. And I'm also happy to talk about the regional distribution of the geographic definition too. That's another topic.
And actually, Alana, can you go back to 2 slides? So slide 16. There you go. I think this also is illustrative into the kind of who's in the DAC and who isn't and what we would consider here. So Amanda, you want to walk through this?
Sure, and we've seen this multiple times before. So I'm just going to walk through it row by row. So the first line shows of all the households in New York, and the actual numbers now might be a little bit higher for all these counts because it's been a few years since this data was broken down this way. 35% of all the households in New York in our 35% scenario are in a DAC. So that's that last column. If you look at where households with incomes less than 80% of AMI are located, about 48% of those households are in DACs. And, we expect it to get higher because, the DAC scenario is really weighted heavily toward income. Then going to even lower income, you see even more lower income people in DACs. So households with incomes that should be less than 200% of federal poverty line, 51% of those households live within the 35% DAC scenario. And getting to an even lower income level, 57% of households in poverty are living within DACs. So that's those column numbers on the right, the percentages, and the column on the left is the actual count of households who are not in a DAC, but could possibly be part of individual accounting. So, if we're just focusing on that 200% federal poverty line as a proxy for 60% of median income, about 1 million additional households who are not in DACs could potentially be a part of the accounting or administration. Any thoughts or questions on this? Another interesting thing here is to just see that 2.5 million households are in a DAC. So, it would be adding an additional 1 million households.
This is Abby. Based on what Rawa said earlier, I found that very compelling about, that people and places are in transition. And these numbers are just so high, the percentage not in DACs. It just wouldn't feel right to me not to have some kind of individual criteria. I think, like you said, Alex, with guardrails. So for me, and so Eddie, this is actually a question for you. How to still have that regional equity and fairness across regions. And the question of whether using AMI or the state median income makes more sense. That is where my mind is I'm kind of hooked on that one right now, in terms of the fairness. But then I think it was Amanda in the chat, you said something about the percentage of DACs in New York City versus elsewhere, and there's a slide about that apparently. So I'm wondering if we can see that slide.
Sure. So Alana, that is, this is all kind of in the analysis of the geographic scenario. So if you go to slide 38. and this isn't quite the cut. Let's talk through this, and then I just calculated a couple of other things for us. So what this shows is statewide 35% of tracks and approximately of people are in DACs. And then these numbers are all the percentage of each region that's a DAC. So this is showing that in New York City, 45% of census tracts and roughly people would be DACs. And you see the, the next highest is Mid-Hudson. In Mid-Hudson, 44% of tracts and people would be in DACs. So that's just saying that proportionally more people in New York City and Mid-Hudson would be in the DAC designation, just because those 45% and 44% are over that 35%. But you can cut the same numbers a different way and say, of all of the people in DACs, where do the people in DACs live? And I don't have a slide for that, but let me just voice over some numbers. So of all of the people who would be in the 35% DAC designation, 60% of them are in New York City, compared to 43% of the state's population living in New York City. So greater than proportional there. The next highest would be Mid-Hudson, which would make up 15% of the people in DACs, compared with being 12% of New York State's population. So, I mean, you can kind of compare the numbers on the left and the right to say if the number on the left is higher, it means it's getting a more than proportional share. Oh, no, that's not quite right. Okay. Stick with the numbers on the slide and let me know if you're curious what share of all DACs a certain region is.
I'm a little bit confused by this.
I'm sorry, at the risk of dumbing this down even further, which is my usual contribution to these calls, if you could, Amanda, just big picture, what is this slide communicating? Big picture, not specifically, but writ large.
It's communicating that there's regional variation in the share of people in DACs. On the left, any place where that number is over 35% has more than proportional people in DACs. So New York City has the greatest extra number of people in DACs. So New York City, Mid-Hudson, Finger Lakes, Central New York are getting just slightly more than their proportional share of DACs. And what this slide doesn't show is that of all of the people in DACs, that 2.5 million people, 60% of them live in New York City.
So let me just take a crack at my hooked on phonics reflection of this. Is it fair to say that the more individual households get added into our formula, that will reduce the amount of DAC recipients, say in areas of the state like New York City that have a disproportionate share of DACs? And I don't even know if my question itself is clear. And if it is, yeah, I think it's the regional part that I think is making me a little.
Yeah.
Is that a fair? Yeah.
The individual definition fills the cup more for numbers that are lower here. So it would fill the cup more for North Country, Southern Tier, depending on whether they actually have a lot of low-income people. I don't know how much it would fill it for Long Island. It would definitely fill the cup more for rural areas.
And hence the discomfort that and I think others from New York City may have had with this is that we want to be as inclusive as possible. In doing so, are we hurting our own communities? That's a pretty existential problem that I'm having is, so anyway, but it goes right back to the original point that Alex, Rawa, and others have made. It sucks to be talking about this in the zero sum way, but that is the story of this entire society, right? Thanks again, Amanda, appreciate it.
Amanda, if I could just point to something that was recently sent to me, is I think in places like New York City, places like Long Island in particular, when you do the level of ground truthing, I think there's just so many like regional variances, right? And I don't know if we did, because I didn't know about this until just recently, is looking at like housing mobility metrics or the family budget calculator as being better than looking at annual median income, because I think, places like Long Island specifically that are under all kinds of threat, including having some like pockets of poverty, but also like pockets of just a lot of wealth. It's really difficult to, I think, use maybe the tools that we've set up to kind of get to the kind of truths that we need to get to really be able to help families, especially because not only are they facing an economic and like historic threats, but they're also facing, real climate change, like weather disruptions and catastrophes. And then I think, like as Eddie rightly points out, New York City is so dense, right? And you've got the greatest populations. Obviously, the inequities are really, really deep in different ways that maybe upstate is facing. Would it be better to try to maybe use different screening tools for, different regions to kind of get to more of what Eddie, I think, wants to get to, which is, not to disadvantage any DAC?
Great questions. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of data we could want on housing mobility and migration that just isn't, there yet at the granular level. With respect to different scoring or screening tools for different regions, we still do have that embedded into this process. So what we have is the process that we are kind of allowing New York City communities to have their own scale, allowing New York State, rest of the state to have its own scale, and then having a statewide scale, and taking the top 35% of each of those scales respectively. And that's actually what enables New York City to end up with more than a proportional share to get to it having 60%, because it's showing up, many more New York City communities are showing up in the top portion of the statewide scale, and then also have the opportunity to show up again in their regional New York City scale. That said, I mean, we still do have a system where all the indicators are used, for all the places. We, haven't moved to a system where there's different indicators for different places. But what that means is, once everything's kind of compared, New York City like versus like, some of those rural indicators just don't matter that much for any of the tracks. Does that answer your question, Rawa?
It does. It's just hard. Eddie, I'm feeling definitely, I think, dumber in this conversation than I ever have. So it's a lot to wrap our heads around. Yeah.
Could I offer?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Eddie, you go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to, because I'm not sure if I'm grasping this fully. So if I could test for understanding maybe here for myself for a second, and tell me if I'm right or wrong. So when I look at this slide and I see the 45 is above the 43, meaning that, proportionally New York City is doing well based on percent of population. And you mentioned the 60% of households in New York City are within a DAC. Is that right? It's about 60%. So that information sounds like, okay, New York City is doing well, is getting their fair share. But what I don't think I see on this slide, and I don't know if you've given us this number yet, is what percentage of New York City's low-income households are within the DAC definition? Are they, like, is that fair?
That is not on this slide. We have that broken down a little bit by urban, suburban, rural. Alana, if you go to slide 49, and this was something we presented a couple of meetings ago. Not that this is at all a clear slide, but so what this shows is, so let's just look at the bars on the right for a second. So this just shows that in urban areas across the state, 56% of people across all urban areas are within a DAC. So generally urban areas, as you've seen, have more DACs. And then within urban areas, about 74% of high poverty households. So this was just less than the federal poverty line. 74% of high poverty households live in a DAC. So it's saying that DAC definition is capturing 74% of high poverty households in urban areas. Contrast that to suburban areas where in general the DAC definition picks up about 50% of high poverty households and 50% are left out of the geographic DACs. And then in rural areas, which generally fewer rural communities are in DACs in general. So across the state, only 19% of rural census tracts are currently designated a DAC. And then in rural areas, about 26% of high poverty households live in the proposed DACs, meaning 74% of those high poverty households less than $17,000 a year are not in a DAC.
So if I were to restate that, I would say DAC definition works really well. The geographic definition works really well in urban communities, does not work well in rural communities.
Right,
so,
mainly because of kind of the dispersion of households, less concentration of high poverty households living. Well, that and the DAC definition just isn't capturing a lot of rural tracts.
Yeah, okay. So based on what I think I just heard on those last couple slides and, you know, with you helping us think through this, it sounds to me like it is fair. And Eddie, please feel free to push back on that, like in terms of proportion of what New York City is, you know, currently going to be getting under this scenario. In a lot,
for what it's worth,
Alex,
Abby, I still have trouble grasping I hear what you're saying. I'm just not seeing it, but please, I'll keep going.
No, it's totally confusing. And again, like Amanda and Alex, if I am misinterpreting, please correct me.
So then, thanks Abby for this thought process. I found this helpful and this is phenomenal. Then, so on top of that, to help me think about the same question, if we add the income, are we therefore then capturing more of the rural households that are not in the geographical DAC definition? And we're doing better with capturing those households outside of the definition. But if the New York City geographical definition is more inclusive, then this adding the income piece will just maybe simply be more helpful for capturing more of the rural folks than capturing more of the urban people. Does that make sense? I guess that's a question, if that's right or not.
That's correct. So we don't have the numbers broken down that way in that exact cut in this deck, but we can certainly do that analysis to say if you took together either a geographic DAC or low income, what percentage of each region, what percentage of people in each region would fall into one of those two buckets, and we could certainly do that.
This is Chris. Can I just offer, we may also want to think about, developing some sort of, analytics that we can kind of apply to the, to the criteria that we wind up kind of agreeing to here, just so we can kind of get at some of these, these open questions. Because I don't know how we're going to answer some of these questions, until we actually see where, where investments are going, or where kind of like some of those low income households that would be participating in programs would be located, relative to the DACs. So, maybe there's like a number of kind of key questions that we know we have to be able to answer when we're assessing the efficacy of the DAC criteria, and we can use that to make modifications. So I'll throw that on the table as well.
When's the vote?
13th, Eddie, or the 21st through the 22nd.
Listen, man, I don't know about the rest of the working group, but we're gonna get this. I want to be done with this on the 13th. I'm just trying to. I'm getting there, but I just want to. This is for everyone. Like, folks, this is not going to go on forever. We're going to make a decision, but as everyone can see, it's complicated. But thanks.
Yeah.
And following that, Eddie, this is Abby. Back to your question, Alex, from way earlier about what other information would we need to know to make the decision. For me, I feel ready to make the decision pretty much, so long as we know that it's an iterative process and that we can tweak as we go, that we're not like locked in forever. So that's where I'm at with it. And I don't think there's much of any other information you could provide at this point that would significantly affect, where I was leaning on this.
In these uncomfortable silences. Way to push yourself. What then can we do? So where can we go? Just discussed. Great time. I love it, Abby. Okay, we have gone for 2 hours. Let's come back in 10 minutes. So at, doing the math, 12:12. That's really beautiful and symmetrical. So we're going to do that. Everyone come back at 12:12. Thank you all.
So this first kind of darker column, the regional share of geographic DACs, is the number of households who live within the 35% DAC scenario. So this is kind of that 60% I was talking about. So of all of the geographic DACs, 59% of all the people who live in DACs, 59% of the people who live in DACs are in New York City. And then what I did in this middle column is add in people outside of DACs who have incomes less than 200% of the federal poverty line, which is our proxy for that 60% of AMI. So once you add those in and look at the distribution again, that second column with the green highlights that says regional share of all eligible households, that's once you add up the 2.5 million people in DACs and the 1 million people outside of DACs with incomes in this range, look at that 3.5 million people, how are they distributed? And we see the share that New York City holds is a little bit less, but still more than proportional. So if we think about all of those households, that combined number, 53% of all of those households are in New York City, which is still greater than its kind of proportional share. I'm not saying the proportional share is fair, but it's still greater than that 43%, which is the number of people who live in New York City. The only other region that has a slightly greater than proportional share is the Mid-Hudson region. And, all the other regions have slightly less than proportional share of households in DAX. So this is showing that even adding, even filling up things more in rural areas, adding more low-income households in rural areas, we still end up in a situation that New York City has 53% of all of the people in a geographic DAC or extra low-income people. Lots of numbers. I don't know if this actually helps with decision making.
I think it can, in the sense of what you see the relative risk of dropping off or changing or adjusting things.
Mm-hmm.
But I am going to push because I think we're getting close to that time when it's really important to start thinking about, okay, how would we define LMI? And are we going to add it or not? And I think we need to make those decisions today, or at least get to 95% feeling of those decisions. So I'm going to start an uncomfortable silence and wait for someone to talk.
Hey, Alex, can you I keep forgetting because there's been so many slides and always a deep appreciation to Loom for crunching and recontextualizing at every turn for us. So thank you. Can you go back to whichever slide kind of lays out what these decision points are for us? Believe it or not, Amanda, this really does help me and I know where I've been leaning for a while, but all these conversations really do help. But yeah, it might be helpful for all of us, Alex, to get to brass tacks of like, what do you think are the actual decisions we need to make today in order to keep progress going for the final vote?
Okay, where is that slide?
Slide 6, the original one.
It might be, yeah.
Let's go there.
And so we just take notes on that. So Amanda, if you can take notes while I chat through. Okay.
Sure.
At the check boxes, it's just the progress made. Are we all good with that? I think the one part is this designate 35 to 40% of the state. Can we all feel like no matter what, we're going to designate 35%, not 40%? I want to take that about.
Did we decide last time that it was going to be 36%? I know it's just 1 percentage point, but
yeah, I think 36% was what we had in the model, but then we figured out the like small percentage changes to make it add up to perfectly 35% for the whole thing. If you're cool with that, let's do that.
So Alex, are you asking, are we confirming that we generally like 35% with or without income criteria?
That's
or we're
what
just
I'm
saying
asking to confirm, yeah. My sense was that everyone was feeling that that would be better than even expanding before, or expanding it if we don't have. So I just want to get a sense if that's true or not with this group right now today. This doesn't hold you to the vote per.
would it help to break that down to say if it were only geographic, it should be this, and if it were geographic or income, it should be something else?
Yeah, that was the slide you guys showed earlier, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll move on from that. Let's talk about add income-based individual criteria. Where are people on that one? On the top right, this is the decisions. These are the decisions.
This is Rawa. I'm still a yes.
Cool. Thanks, Rawa.
Yes from Sonal.
Says, okay, yes for Sonal, yes for Abby,
Yes for Jonathan.
yes for Donathan.
Just a word about accountability in a densely packed part of the state. People hold you accountable walking down the street. So I'm going to say a tentative yes, and anybody who assaults me after this call, recognize it was a tentative yes.
But Eddie, it's okay to say no. Like I want us to understand, and I know you're an adult. We always say it's okay to say no to my 6-year-old who just had a hard transition to school. It's okay.
Maybe to that kind of open question though, not to get in the way of everybody like saying where they're comfortable, but if we're, if there are open questions, right, or uncertainties that we just aren't going to be able to like have like a definitive like yes or no, like it will or will not do something or make things worse in one part of the state or whatever, and not to take that lightly, but I guess I'm wondering, should we start to pull together like what are those like open questions or concerns that we have now? And I think we should think about how to, like, as we're kind of reviewing and assessing the criteria, like after we actually have some data to look at, build out some of those kind of analyses that we want to make sure we're doing. So like what are the different lenses we need to kind of like assess the criteria, and that might help us just get a little more comfortable with an approach today, just with all of the unknowns that are still kind of out there in terms of what the actual investments would look like, and then allow for calibration. So I'll just throw that out there as something we could kick around a little bit more later on.
I like this, Chris, as a way of almost adding guardrails in that way, right? So in other words, saying tell me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, is when you put forward this criteria, it's here are the additional questions, considerations that we want to check in year 1 of our assessment of this. And so here we want you agencies go forth and give us this number, these numbers, try to get this so that we can, and it's not just the agencies, but researchy bits too, of trying to understand where things lay so that in the coming year afterward, we're making adjustments with a lot more information. Is that correct?
Yeah, essentially. So, what do we need to how do we need to kind of look at the criteria in practice, right? So once we get to a point where there's a public input process and we finalize criteria, then the agencies have to report, kind of against that criteria. That'll give us a lot of intel and a lot of, an opportunity to understand what the implications of, these initial decisions might be.
Okay, so as we go through this, and I think particularly for the individual based criteria, then we add this, what do we need to know? What do we want to know? That will help us show that there are changes, etc. So that will be part of what we recommend. That's part of what we outline then.
And Alex, the analysis I think is ongoing. So, I wouldn't just like put it in year 1. I think Rawa might have made the point, like this is iterative, we're gonna, or maybe it was Abby, sorry guys. But we'll have to, keep an eye on how this is playing out.
Okay. So if and it would seem, I think we're at 5 yes, 1 tentative yes. Are there any no's out there? Or like really questioning this, worried about it? Okay, so then we're getting to the how do we define? LMI households or low-income households. Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot. Which one would you feel is easiest for, because we can only have one, easiest for the programs to implement or to work with?
Well, I mean, it's the current, you know, mix of programs is kind of, you know, up to 80% of AMI. So there will always be, you know, programs that are targeted there. But again, this is where like I'm having a hard time because, you know, not understanding like what the potential distribution might look like, you know, between the one band of households under 60 and how, you know, generally statewide, it's kind of like, you know, it's something like 2.3 million households are at 60 and below, 60 is state median income and below, and there's about another million to 1.2 million households that are between 60 state median income and 80 area median. But a lot of those folks, I think, are in kind of metro areas. From the last time I kind of recall seeing data. So,
Quick question: is it possible to pull up the relevant slide? It might be helpful for all of us. I'm following Chris, but it might be helpful for everyone to just see the slide that I think really captures what Chris is expressing right now.
I think that's either slide 16 or 18. So let's start with 16. So here in this first column, let's just think about the people not indexed. So
sorry, Amanda, we're not seeing the slide.
Oh, Alana,
yeah,
can you
didn't
just
update.
slide 16, please? Okay, so let's just look at the first column of the people not indexed. So of there's about 1.6 million people with incomes below 80% area median income, not in a DAC, and about 1 million people with incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line, not in DAC. So we're talking about this kind of additional 600,000 people.
Okay.
And you know, and the trade-off of that is what's on slide 18. It just is how big this pie gets. So on slide 18, adding 60% of state median income would be a little bit more than this middle row. So would bring us to just above 50%, maybe about 50% of households would be either in a DAC or added. And then adding less than 80% of area median income, it would bring us to, you know, 58% in that range, either in a geographic DAC or added outside of those areas.
And I can't remember, this is Rawa, what is it more or less advantageous for New York City in particular around the 60% state median income? Or is it more beneficial for all communities really when you use area median income?
Yeah, area median income, because of that difference between state and 60% state and 80% area, going to the 80% area median income threshold would add a lot more people proportionally in New York City and areas with higher incomes. So likely Long Island as well.
I'm sorry, is the mic on? Oh, sorry, everyone. So the other thing I'm just trying to look at the numbers of the LMI budgets to give a little more, maybe more context that could help. So the bulk of the income eligible programs in the state are focused on the households that are at 60% of SMI and below. Quick back of the envelope, of the $1 billion that we had spoken about earlier, two and a half hours ago, I want to say roughly, 80 to 85% of those budgets of that $1 billion would be going to low-income households specifically. Actually, maybe closer to 90% of that budget. So, kind of the add-on in terms of like the moderate income, in terms of like the resources going to those individual households, wouldn't be, it would be kind of, less impactful, I guess, if we're talking about like the potential of like shifting dollars.
Okay, I guess I know we need to vote. I know we're all exhausted here. So I'm going to say I would be open to making it 80% area median income, but then what are some guardrails that we can add to it? Because I think what we're talking about here is we're primarily really just trying to get all households in New York State to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. We have to be able to make the accessibility to these resources as easy as possible for low to moderate income, New Yorkers, period. And so what are some guardrails that we want to add? But I'm more for being more inclusive than exclusive.
Okay. You mentioned guardrails. So I think one of the ways that you can do guardrails for this is the way that California has done it. So Amanda can walk us through that, and forgive me for not knowing which slide. We are really bouncing back and forth. It's kind of fun.
Let's roll the dice and go to slide 22. Okay, so this this kind of California layers things a little bit differently, but they have both a geographic component of their priority populations definition and a low income. They have an extra geographic layer. So they have the geographic disadvantaged communities, then they have geographic low income communities, which adds a little slice, and then also low income households. So what they did for their accounting purposes is to say, that's this blue slice of the pie. A minimum of 25% of the proceeds invested should be invested in projects located within and benefiting people living in disadvantaged communities. So this is the geographic component. So they're saying, in total, we want to see the total percentage of funds across all these slices, but we're putting a minimum threshold on funds that you kind of get credit for geographically or versus eligible individually. So saying we want to see a minimum of 25% of funds get distributed geographically, and a minimum of 5% to low-income communities, and a minimum of 5% for households. And you wouldn't necessarily need to set those other minimums, but this is the idea of setting a geographic minimum.
Quick question, Amanda. Do you guys know what the distinction is between low-income communities and low-income households?
Yeah, so low-income communities is geographic. So it's saying, okay, so in our scenario, we have 45 different variables of all sorts of things. And because we have all the environmental factors and everything else, our geographic definition doesn't necessarily cover every single low-income community if you just define a community based on income alone. So they did, okay, so let's have our geographic definition and then see what other communities are outside of that definition, but still on average fairly low income. And I think we did that analysis a while ago and said, if our geographic decks were 35%, and we tried to circle back around and gather the low income communities only based on income, I think it was going to add maybe 4% more. But we also did some analysis showing that that still doesn't come close to filling the gap on low income households. And that's what drove this analysis of how many low income households are left out. Because even if you add those kind of 4% of extra low income communities, because of how distributed low income households are, it still didn't get all the low income households.
Hey Amanda, if no one else has a follow-up on that, just maybe some additional context would be helpful. So is it right, I could be completely wrong, but my understanding was California applied this framework to kind of a specific pot of funding, their climate investments. They don't apply it to kind of the broader set of like other energy, like WAP isn't included in this, HEAP isn't included in this, the ratepayer funded programs not included in this, right? So there was another reason to include kind of this additional frame because they wanted to make sure that these specific investments were also touching not only DACs but low income communities.
Right. Yeah. It's two different streams of legislation and policy. And this is the greenhouse gas emissions side that's administered by the Air Resources Board. And the CPUC is different and they don't have a framework like this.
Jewel yet?
But the main idea we really wanted to show here is one potential of many additional rules if people are concerned about geographic targeting is to establish something like this blue slice. But if you're not concerned about it, then maybe this isn't helpful.
Just to make sure I got Chris's point. Chris, are you saying that, and Amanda's explanation is that this category was intended for a specific pot of funding that did not get captured by their version, not their version of CLCPA, but what I'm saying, like their, in other words, we do a more expansive job with the CLCPA in that we don't need this because we already captured all of the different climate investment funds that would be relevant for these kind of decisions. So we don't need this. In other words, they needed this extra breakdown for a pot of money that was missing, that is probably not missing in what the CLCPA captured. That's a Chris question, I think.
That's my understanding. Yeah, that's my understanding.
All right, thanks.
So this is Abby. Two things related, more or less, about, Alex, back to your question about what additional information do we need to make the decision. This piece with the kind of what are the guardrails, this I feel like we actually don't have the information we need to make good decisions about what exactly, like if we were to designate any kind of percentage of the funds that are supposed to go to this or that. And what I would propose, I don't know, just throwing it out there to see what kind of reaction you guys, what kind of reaction it gets, is that maybe this piece of the decision making we save until the end of year one, where we have better information about where investments are going, or just further down the line to see, like, do we need to designate a specific amount of funds for this and a specific amount of funds for this, or is it already playing out in a way that is helpful? So that was thing number one. Thing number two, back to the, oh, sorry, go ahead. Somebody. Okay. So thing number two about the state median income versus area median income question. I could be convinced either way, so I don't have really strong feelings about this one. But just in terms of laying out what the pros and cons of the different approaches are, I think it would be helpful if we can just just really clearly kind of articulate those. And so let me take a stab at it. Tell me what I'm missing. Going with state median income, that's what most of the programs, existing energy programs already use. So from an administrative perspective, that is easiest. So that would be a pro for state median income. On the pro of area median income side, it would kind of maybe add a little in terms of geographic fairness, in that not meaning that one region gets more or less of the whole pie, but that individuals, households within each region can make the transition, can take advantage of the programs just based on, what it costs to live in those places. And maybe another pro of that one is that it is more inclusive overall, that we include more people. And actually, I'm not sure what the cons were, except for the flip side of all of those. So can somebody just chime in with like, what am I missing, or did I get any of that wrong?
Got any of that wrong? I do want to kind of start with I think it's actually really kind of a good idea to wait on this threshold of investments until you have more data. And in fact, that's what California did, right? So they saw where it was missing and then added this later on. And I think that that's a good move to have, to make sure that this is, perfectly imperfect. To your point, and I know Amanda can really talk through the differences between 80% AMI and 60% state median income, and kind of the valuation of going broader with the 80% AMI or the 60% SMI. I wish that we had this world where we could do 60% of AMI, but I'm not sure that that's implementable. And so then we have to kind of choose which one would work best.
Chris, to follow up on what you just put in the chat, thank you for that additional point. I'm thinking about accessibility, program accessibility, and the ease of participation in programs, not actually on the like NYSERDA administration side, but on the user or participant side. And so, one thing I think I mentioned in the past is that like geo-eligibility is great. Anything where people don't have to provide a lot of additional paperwork or, income verification, great. So would using 60% of state median income, since it is used for these other programs, allow people to kind of automatically qualify for things and not have to submit additional applications for various programs?
Yes. The bulk of, and I'll just speak from NYSERDA's experience, and I can give you a little bit more context on like what's happening like interagency wise to like further make that process simpler. But I think nearly half of our low income households that are served by NYSERDA and Empower, and I think we're at about like 18 to 19,000 households that we serve every year with Empower. Are categorical eligible, so they've already received another benefit, and they're showing us their letter, or we're checking ourselves based on what's available to us from other agencies. We don't really have that for 80% of AMI, except for affordable housing focused programs where we know that those tenants and those households were established to be eligible to live there. So that would be the only kind of other caveat there. But there's a lot of work that's happening to basically make it simpler to do income verification using data from agencies like OTDA, and so at some point right early next year, I think we're going to have like an automated, close to an automated process to determine people to be eligible. So it will make it a lot easier for the household or the participant to access the program.
Regardless of which option we choose, Chris, or not regardless of which option we choose? Meaning that, 60% of state income or 80% area median income.
We're always going to have a bit of a challenge with the 80% of AMI, just because, you know, most households at that income band, unless they, you know, do like reside in affordable housing, you know, there may not be other programs that they're eligible for. So we would have to collect documentation from them and determine their eligibility.
Okay, based on that, I would say I slightly favor the 60% of state median.
This is Rawa. I just want to also co-sign on Abby's sort of guardrail that I would like for it to be added to the notes of, you know, doing an evaluation a year from now to see if we need to add more guardrails around the individual criteria piece. And regarding the definition of a low-income household, I'm in favor of starting out with the 60% SMI, but over time, especially as the state agencies have better infrastructure in place to be able to do the 80%, that we over time move to that distinction. But starting out with, I think, you know, it's kind of, you know, a lot of frontline groups, and I think the design of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is that investments go to the most impacted individuals across the state to transition to clean energy. So I think that is where initial investments should be directed to, but that over time, you know, that we go from kind of the low income to also the moderate income homeowners, so that we are able to transition all New Yorkers over, you know, scaffold them in.
We've got 12 minutes left, and I actually think that we're drilling down into a probable set of criteria that we can vote on. It's not perfect, but I think what we have right now, let me summarize. We have the geographic approach that we've talked about with those 44 indicators. Keep that at 35%. We then add a low income criteria at 60 SMI for the first year. And in addition to that, we add recommendations / requirements to annually evaluate at the minimum to assess and understand how the investments are working with this area, and what we should do to adjust that LMI component, and also, frankly, the geographic one. Is it working? Is it not? Is that an appropriate summary of what I've just heard? Rawa says yes, so I'm just going to go with that. And I want to get a temperature check with a kind of thumbs up, medium, thumbs down kind of feeling of where we're at right now. And so I'm just going to go down the line. Abby, thumbs up, medium, thing, or down?
Yep, thumbs up.
Cool. Chris?
Medium to thumbs up.
Relay any worries, questions, or anything like that, or you just want to leave it at medium thumbs up?
I'm just thinking. I'm generally in support. I'm just, trying to think about any other implications that we might have spoken about yet.
Okay. Donathan, how are you doing with all this?
Donathan's doing well. I'm very pleased with the progress we've made at this point, and I very much appreciate the annual reevaluation. I think that was critically important as we continue to move forward. So, onward for me.
Okay, Eddie, how you feeling?
Much better after I finish this cup of coffee. But yeah, I'm medium also. I am still really struggling with the 60 versus the 80. Like that's yeah. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I like the idea, and obviously love the idea of revisiting in a year's time. But Thanks.
Voting member, Jared? Yeah, I'm going to go down to Mary Beth.
I feel pretty good about it. In a pretty good spot.
Okay, so thumbs up with a slight tweak at an angle.
Yep, perfect.
Great angle down. Yeah. Neil, how you doing?
Sorry, trying to get off mute. I mean, I think that given the difficulties in making a perfect fit, I think where we're at now is good. I would be thumbs up.
Rava?
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate how challenging this meeting has been, and I feel like my head's slightly broken. But I'm also a thumbs up with maybe just, a little bit of, I think it's the best we can do for this moment, and I'm appreciative of being there with a slight tweak if possible, but thumbs up.
I get it. And also, I'm pushing hard because I know we all want to get to a vote. So I appreciate that this is not going to be perfect, but I love the idea of continuous improvement and assessment. Okay, we've got Sonal. I think you're the last.
I agree with the broken head, Rawa. I am mostly at the thumbs up.
Okay. Did I miss anyone? Okay.
Alana? Is Alana
I
here?
guess technically me, yes.
Yeah, Alana. Yeah.
Yes,
How are
I
you
am.
feeling about it?
I'm feeling pretty good. I'm feeling thumbs up.
Okay. So I'm feeling like the next steps for us is to summarize this. We'll send it an email, summarize this in the PowerPoint so that we can kind of come up with an official set of criteria that we're feeling that we can discuss. What I'd like is then to get and set up any kind of, if you have any questions or concerns, that you send those back to us so that we're ready to vote. I believe, am I right? Is that next week?
Thursday the 9th is our next meeting. So I know it's so close and we want to have information and data prepared. Honestly, I would love to ask for, any kind of written feedback, tweaks, questions people have maybe by end of day tomorrow, if you have some time to jot things down so we can make sure we have everything lined up for next week.
Amanda and Alana, can you just you may have done this at the very beginning. I didn't think so though, but can you guys share with us what is like what are the tangible expectations for the next two meetings? And maybe like even if you even have a draft agenda in mind would be really, really helpful.
Sure. Can you hear me? Sorry. So the meeting on the 9th, which will be a 2-hour meeting, not a 3-hour one, at 2:00, will be to go over some of the maps and some of the geographical data, just, and any questions that anybody might have. Just kind of to get all those hammered out, make sure everybody is really, really comfortable with everything before we vote on the 13th, which is Monday.
Yeah, that was the main thing we wanted to cover. It sounds like in this meeting we need to expand the agenda and make sure we're talking about all remaining topics. Another thing we haven't talked about yet that we hope to do today is just what physically you want to see or review and have in your hands before the vote. So an updated version of this PowerPoint. Do you want to see actually a list of census tracts? Do you want to receive the maps file again? What do you want to be able to kind of review before the vote?
And we could also extend that meeting. I know that not everybody is super thrilled with 3-hour meetings, but we can extend that meeting on the 9th and make it 3 hours if that will help us fit more into it.
I'm gonna put it out there that I actually don't think we need to extend it. I think what we've done and talked about today is a solid amount. We have made a lot of decisions going forward, and we can review all of those different elements, but I would say that I know it's hard, and I know everyone's feeling like, 30% off of totally feel great about it, but that's exactly where was always going to be. It's never going to be I feel so great about this definition, because we're making hard choices. So what I would love, and I would like to echo in the last 3 minutes of this, is to send Amanda and me questions you have, things that you want to see, so that we can come prepared for that. And then after that, we come prepared on December 9th to look through all that in preparation for the December 13th meeting.
And we can email out all these slides today that we've updated, so that you have time to look them through and either, send us questions about these slides next week or come to the next meeting with questions from all of the methodology pieces.
Okay, well, we have about 2 minutes left. Does anybody have any other questions or concerns that they want to jump in with before we close things out for today? Oh, we can definitely have a conversation about that, Abby. We'll talk about what that post-vote celebration will look like. But I wouldn't discuss celebrating too quickly, especially once you see what the potential agenda looks like for after the vote. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, everyone. We will get the slides and information out to everyone as soon as possible. Again, if anybody has any concerns or questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Chris, to any member of the Loom. We're definitely here to talk to anyone if you have any questions or concerns. And other than that, I guess I can give everybody a whole minute of their day back. And we'll see everyone next week, 2 o'clock on the 9th. And we should have that should be finalized very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.